Good afternoon, everybody. This is Chuck Williams with Finspire, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, The New Norm, Legal and Tactical Considerations in Returning to Work. For those of you who are not familiar with our company, Finspire is an institutional investment and corporate retirement plan consulting firm. We assist companies with three key areas of corporate retirement plan management: investments, plan governance, and participant outcomes. A couple of our unique specializations are working with companies involved in mergers and acquisitions, as well as those offering or interested in offering executive benefit programs to recruit and retain key personnel. We also have a dedicated financial planning and wealth management practice focused on providing investment and financial consulting for executives and business owners. This is the third in a series of webinars we have been doing to educate and inform institutions and individuals on the impact, opportunities, legislative changes, strategies, etc., in response to the unique environment we've all suddenly been thrust into as a result of COVID-19. Our first webinar focused on the CARES Act provisions related to corporate retirement plans and the impact on 401ks, 403bs, and pension plans. Our second webinar focused on incorporating the U.S. government stimulus bills into your company financial plans. Today's webinar will focus on legal implications and considerations as the economy reopens and businesses look to reopen their offices. Joining me today are David Wayne and Jason Tremblay, both attorneys and partners at the law firm Saul Ewing Arnstein Lehr. David Wayne is a trusted advisor and litigator who handles complex business and contract disputes. His expertise is in employment-related issues, commercial contracts, and real estate. Jason Tremblay is a business attorney and litigator who advises companies, educational institutions, and local governments on understanding and interpreting employment law and managing commercial disputes. As I mentioned, my name is Chuck Williams. I'm a co-founder of Finspire and senior retirement plan advisor. I'm also an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, where I teach a course on retirement planning and employee benefits. I will be moderating today's discussion. So although it seems like a lifetime ago, it's only a couple of months back we were in a relatively normal business and economic environment. Since then, most of our lives have been upended in ways we never really could have anticipated. So having had dozens of conversations with business owners and executives over the last several weeks, it becomes apparent to us that while we are all in the same storm, we are clearly not all in the same boat. The severity of the COVID impact on businesses has varied greatly and has been dependent on a variety of factors, including industry, geography, size, and structure of a company. Frankly, sometimes just plain luck, good and bad. The positives of late is that there are clear steps being made both in the public and private sector to reopen our economy, our companies, and our institutions. The question is, what will be the new normal? And what legal considerations and strategies should companies be aware of as they reopen their offices, which is the focus of our discussion today. We anticipate our discussion will last less than an hour. All attendees are on mute. Please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A tab. We'll try to answer as many as possible throughout the discussion. We have a very large group today. We may not get to all of the questions. If we don't, we'll follow up with you with an email answer after our discussion today. A recording of today's webinar, as well as prior and future webinars, is available through the link on our company website, which you see in front of you, which is www.finspireme.com. And we have additional information on there as well. So to start our discussion today, we are going to open it up with a poll question. Pardon me. So poll questions start out with, if you would answer, all answers to this are confidential. You want to get a kind of a gauge of what people are thinking. So what is your plan for fully reopening your office? To reopen it gradually? Reopen fully? Really no plan for full reopening at this time? Or the offices remain fully opened in the past? As I mentioned, as we have these discussions with companies throughout the country in various different industries, it is really interesting to see how varied the responses are and how the impact is. So we'll close the polling now, and we'll share the results. So as you see, 69% reopen gradually. That is not surprising to me. That is what we see most companies doing. Interesting, 12% have stayed fully opened. So as you see, a lot of companies are in different spots. It's a great way to kind of segue into this discussion today. And go into the presentation, and we'll start out with discussion on just the current return to work landscape and guidance. And I'll turn it over to Jason and David to give us some more information on this topic.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chuck. And this is Jason Tremblay. First and foremost, I really just hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. And you know, obviously, I wish I didn't have to talk on this topic. It would mean things were much better. But you know, obviously, and David, I can speak for David as well. You know, we're very happy to discuss this issue and to try to provide you know, some of the suggestions that that you know, we've come across in our, you know, with our clients and things like that to do. To make, you know, returning to work, you know, as easy as possible. Obviously, we sort of flipped over the, you know, the first screen, but, you know, I wouldn't be an attorney if I didn't sort of lay out the typical attorney disclaimer that, you know, everything that we're talking about right now, whether we're going to be talking, you know, whether we're talking about returning to work, whether we're talking about things in the past like the FFCRA, or the CARES Act, these are all evolving very, very quickly, sometimes even daily. These regulatory agencies are putting out advice on a daily basis. Sometimes they're retracting it and issue new stuff. So, you know, obviously nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice, and each situation is unique. If a specific situation arises, please do not hesitate to contact your legal advisor in those particular circumstances. So, you know, Dave and I were talking about this, and we thought the first place to really start off with on this topic is where do things currently stand? Okay, where are they? And the reality is there is a huge variety of state stay-at-home orders. You know, some of which range from there are no restrictions at all to you can't go outside. So that's obviously resulted in a wide variety of easing restrictions. You know, just by way of example, we have certain more stringent restrictions here in Illinois, but across the border in Indiana, it's almost return to work as normal, minus 2 or 3 different counties where there's still pretty significant restrictions. So I think one thing to keep in mind as we go through this, and you will we'll probably be beating a dead horse here, but there's not going to be one size fits all. You know, if you have multiple offices in multiple locations, what plan or what advice that might apply to that particular return to work landscape might be different than what we're going to advise here. So you're going to hear that very, very frequently throughout the day, throughout this conference, and ultimately, you know, care must be given if you have multiple jurisdictions. At the end of this, the real crux, what we're really going to be talking about today, is this balance between employee safety, right, which is the primary concern, versus the survival of the business. You know, sometimes those two interests are aligned and sometimes they're not. So again, what plan, what return to work plan that we create or that you create for your particular business is going to be different, and no one size fits all. So our goal for today is sort of highlight and give you some tools to use and employ in your situation, especially if it's in Illinois. Keep in mind that there are, from that polling, it's clear that folks are thinking about a phased-in approach. There's a lot of companies in Illinois that are not essential and are not returned to work yet. Okay, so now is the time to start thinking about this. So again, we appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic, and we will continue to do so. David, do you have any other comments, at least initially?
No, hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is David Wayne, and thank you, as Jason said, for joining us. Jason touched upon some of the things, obviously, that I'll be talking about as we go throughout. But I think we can just, kind of move forward with the agenda and hope to get as many questions as possible covered.
Great. Well, one of the things that I know we wanted to talk about, and Chuck, I'm sure there are going to be some questions that come in as this seminar goes on. But one of the big points about this particular screen is and the importance of following the guidance. As I started off, there is so much guidance out there from the EEOC, from the OSHA, from the CDC, There is specific industry-related guidance. As you can see from here, the NRA, well, the National Restaurant Association has implemented some guidance. The National Association of Home Builders. There's a whole slew of now what I would call heightened cleaning, not regulations, but guidance that hotels are implementing in order to make their employees feel safe, and in order for when we do reopen, that their patrons and their customers will feel comfortable that they go there, that they won't get sick. So the real starting point for everyone is to make sure and understand what the guidance is. Look at it. We've provided you resources here. I will briefly touch on the EEOC, and I'll briefly touch on the CDC. The importance of following these guidelines, right? At the end of the day, is really twofold. One, it's to comply with the law. Best defense in any type of litigation, in any type of claim is, hey, I followed what the CDC was saying. I complied with how the EEOC said that we can onboard our employees now. Okay, so if you follow that, it's your best defense. But more importantly, what you'll hear is it's important to follow that because it makes your employees feel safer, okay? If you can say, here's what the 4 or 5 steps we are taking, and we're following the CDC's recommendations on there, at least it will give some level of comfort. So I layer our conversation, at least initially, on the fact that know what your guidance is, what applies to you, implement that into your return to work plan. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And most importantly is keep in mind that these regulations, what I'm talking about from the EEOC or the CDC, could very well change. In fact, just a couple days ago, the EEOC issued some question and answers, and it retracted 1 or 2 of them. It's constantly evolving, and if you look at some of these websites, it's actually stating this stuff is actually evolving pretty quickly. Just look at 2 months ago, right? We didn't have to wear face masks. Now it's the norm. In fact, you could probably be liable if you don't. So just keep in mind, again, that this is evolving. I want to just briefly touch on the EEOC guidance that I refer to. The EEOC is mostly, what I'd like to say, it's mostly tailored to equal employment opportunity issues, such as, like what questions and inquiries you can make of employees and applicants, what questions you can ask about their conditions, what accommodations are needed, and what efforts, can employers do to screen. Those are some of the issues that the EEOC has pushed out a lot of guidance on. I don't want to talk about all of them, but I want to give 5 or 6 sort of high-level modifications as a result of this pandemic. Things that normally wouldn't really apply, or shall we say wouldn't be allowed, but are sort of allowed in this pandemic situation. Again, real briefly, temperature checks are allowed. In fact, there's a lot of folks and a lot of my clients are doing, temperature checks. We're going to talk later about sort of the utility of those and whether that really matters. But there are companies out there that are doing it, and there's guidance on how you can do that and how you need to do that. Companies are allowing, or the EEOC is allowing COVID testing. Again, we'll talk about later whether the COVID testing or the antibody testing is really has a lot of high utility, but that's something that you would never see or wouldn't really be allowed for the most part. But in this pandemic, it is. Asking employees whether they're experiencing COVID-related symptoms. Okay, you can do that now. Okay, it's pretty much permissible. Now, what you do with that information might be restricted, but you can do that. The EEOC's answering questions and reiterating the employer's obligation to reasonably accommodate. We'll hear about this again later. The reasonable accommodation side of this is huge. When do you have to accommodate? How do you have to accommodate? And for the most part, the EEOC is basically saying, yeah, you still have to do it, right? And then, of course, the EEOC has pushed out some guidance. When this first happened, and given the genesis of where this came from, it was on the forefront of saying, listen, employers, listen, employees, you got to be careful about taking any retaliation or harassment against anyone based on their either their national origin, their race, or their disability. So there's a lot of Q&A and a lot of guidance that's being pushed out by the EEOC on this. Be familiar with it and talk to your legal counsel as you have specific situations. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe, where OSHA is?
Yeah, so OSHA, obviously deals with workplace safety issues, and there's some interesting guidance in OSHA. For example, there's provisions in OSHA dealing with PPE standards and equipment. There's some general safe workplace duties that have always existed under OSHA that are still out there, and it's a good idea to refresh yourself with those. There's also information regarding record-keeping requirements. And one of the other things I think that's interesting and sort of changing is, OSHA has recognized that you may not be able to comply with OSHA requirements in a timely fashion, whereas pre-COVID that wasn't something they necessarily recognized. And an example of that is if you need PPE equipment and there's a shortage and you can't get what you need, OSHA has already acknowledged and commented on how it understands that it may not be feasible to comply right away. And is almost suggesting do the best you can, like use good faith efforts. And so, for example, if you need PPE equipment that might not be certified for US standards, but are certified elsewhere, and that's what you can get, get that, utilize it. So I would suggest that you look at the OSHA guidance, the links on the materials we've provided, and it's a good starting point. And as Jason said, this is changing. It's, this is new to all of us, and, everything's constantly changing. So, if you looked at it 2 weeks ago, pull up the link again, see if anything's changed on it. Also stay on top of the ever-changing, state, local, county, possibly federal guidelines and information that's out there. So, we all saw this week, the governor came out with his 5-phase Restore Illinois plan. There's more to come from that, and, stay on top of that and stay on top of what's going on with that on a regular basis.
Wonderful. Well, the thing to think about also, the CDC probably was one of the first ones to come out with guidance, and that's been evolved. A lot of the CDC guidance out there has to do, and it really does overlap a lot with OSHA and what the OSHA guidance is. But really, it deals a lot with best practices of educating employees on how to reduce the spread, things we'll talk about later, social distancing, wearing masks, separating sick employees, all the steps we'll talk about with respect to washing hands and things along those lines. One thing that the CDC actually even recommends, which is sort of more in the EEOC realm, is promoting sort of non-punitive sick leave policies and allowing much more flexibility as far as teleworking. And of course, the CDC has its own sort of recommendation list of, what sort of routine office space cleaning would look like, and, providing proper ventilation and things along those lines. So again, when we'll be talking about a return to work plan and a little bit later, but I just encourage you to take a peek at some of these resources. They sometimes can be overwhelming, but they're absolutely crucial as you start to formulate your return to work plan.
Thanks, Jason. If I interrupt for a second, one question that came up, and I should have mentioned this before, is these slides will be available. We'll be sending this out to all the attendees. So if you're feverishly scribbling through, again, we will send this afterwards to you. It's a lot of great information here. And Jason, I can ask a question. We have some really good information here on where to get all of this. It can be somewhat overwhelming for many of us. Can you just give some high-level standards issued by the primary regulatory agencies on what really every company should do at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of addressed a little bit before with the EEOC. I think at the end of the day, every one of these things, whether it's the EEOC or OSHA, it all has to deal with employee safety. The first thing we talked about. So, from a high level perspective, the EEOC is really making sure that you're making personnel decisions that are consistent with its duties and responsibilities. Was you're not making decisions based on someone's purported disability and what have you. I mean, I think some of the high level things I talked about, which is, you're allowed to take temperature checks. You're allowed to do COVID testing. You're allowed to ask questions about, where they've been. In fact, there's a lot of companies right now that are doing these sort of self-assessments. These self-assessments of, okay, we're returning, to work. let's find out whether you've had symptoms. Let's find out whether, where you've been. I think you got to be very careful about what you do with that information. Certainly there are some confidentiality obligations that you need to comply with, and you have to do it in a private and socially responsible way. But that's, those are sort of the high level issues that the EEOC is really looking at. And of course, from OSHA's perspective, which Dave can talk about, it really boils down to, making sure that every employee is as safe as possible. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but the reality is there's a lot of liability out there, right? There's a lot of potential lawsuits out there, from everything ranging from safety issues to wage and hour issues to just retaliation issues. Mm-hmm. And so, when you boil it down, you really have to look to that as your sort of guiding principle. So that's really from the EEOC perspective where things are coming above and beyond what I've already talked about.
Yeah, and let me just add quickly, I know there was a question in advance we received about liability concerns, and we will definitely be getting to that later in the presentation, so stay tuned for that.
Great. So we'll jump to the next slide, new and updated workplace plans and policies.
Sure.
Yeah, Chuck, let me back up a second. I just wanted to make one other comment, sorry. Jason mentioned earlier that, kind of the idea of one size does not fit all. I just wanted to really emphasize that. I think if, one of the key takeaways from this presentation is that exact proposition. And just so everybody understand that, this is going to vary greatly, both geographically, state to state, county to county, city to city. We've seen in Illinois this week with the Restore Illinois plan, they have different zones, and different zones may open up at different times. And so, look, you may be in a situation, you have offices in different zones in the state of Illinois, and then you've got to apply one set of rules to the one zone and one set of rules to the other. It's logistically a pain in the butt, but that's the world we're dealing with. It's going to also vary from types of businesses. Obviously, what a restaurant is facing is very different from what manufacturing is facing, which is very different from what offices are facing. Is remote work feasible for your particular business is a big issue. It's going to vary based on the demographics of your specific workforce. Do you tend to have an older workforce who may be more susceptible to COVID and complications related to it? Do you have more workers who have young families, young children, and are going to have childcare issues? Do you have more commuters, people who are coming in, taking the train, the Metro, the L, that are going to create concerns and issues that they're going to have? It's going to also vary based on the type of building you office in. Are you in a downtown high-rise where you have to take an elevator? Or do you have an open office concept? Obviously, that's been all the rage in the last, in recent years, but open office presents a very unique type of challenges in light of trying to social distance. So at the end of it all, you just have to consider all these variables, and when putting together your return to work plan, you factor those in, and really comes back to what I said at the start of this: one size does not fit all, and you're going to have to look at your particular circumstances.
And it also, if I may add, it can be a living sort of breathing document. You're thinking about your return to work plan. Here are the steps we're going to do, and we'll talk about it. But, as you phase in, there might be changes. There might be, this 20% of the workforce came back. Here's what we realized. Let's modify that for the next 20% that come back to the workforce. So it can be this living, breathing document, which also segues into what David was saying, which no, one size does not fit all. It's not like this is going to be set in stone.
Great. Thanks, guys. So I want to talk about the new and updated workplace plans and policies.
Sure. So maybe I'll start off with that, real quickly, because this is an area that, folks are thinking about, but they probably don't really have the time to, really put pen to paper. As you'll hear from any, I guess, employment attorney, these plans or policies are only as good, if you need it and you're committed to following it. So the worst case scenario is if you have a policy that you don't follow, that's going to be Exhibit A to any unlawful termination claim or retaliation claim or what have you. So when you put pen to paper on this plan and how you return to work, make sure you're following it. Okay, that's number one. But here's here are the policies that I am seeing or being requested to review. Some of these are relatively straightforward. Some of them are not as, not as apparent, but some of the ones that I'm seeing are, of course, travel policies. Virtually everyone is sort of eliminated any non-essential travel, but we're also talking about travel not between country and country, but we're traveling between state and state. We're also talking potentially about travel between offices and offices, right? So there's different hot zones, there's different areas where this is big. So you have to look at the travel policy and whether that needs to be modified. You're clearly looking at unpaid leave of absence policies and PTO policies. How are they applying? There's going to have to be another theme we're going to hear about is patience and flexibility. There's a lot of people that will not be able to come back into the workforce right away for one reason or another. Maybe there's a childcare issue and you have to deal with FFCRA rights, or maybe they're sick, or maybe they're caring for someone who has COVID issues. So, the name of the game in this is you got to look at your, unpaid and PTO policies to make sure that they're not only consistent in complying with current times, but they're complying with what I'd like to say, the increasing amount of leave rights that are popping up on a local level as it relates to this particular pandemic. Visitors in the workplace, okay? Almost every single policy has your standalone, let's be careful and hear the regulations, but I'm very confident that most of my clients now are re-looking at that and putting very strict restrictions on what visitors can come into the workplace. If so, are they being screened? What are the plans and protocols established for someone that we don't know that might be delivering something? So visitors in the workplace. Teleworking obviously is an obvious one. Everybody overnight had to pretty much almost go to teleworking. So if you just have your standard run-of-the-mill teleworking, it might not have the parameters that you need to, for example, make sure that confidential information doesn't walk out the door, trade secret information doesn't walk out the door, or that there's certain checks and balances as to how those employees are supposed to track their time and work under teleworking circumstances. Clearly, reasonable accommodation policies need to be looked at both from a disability standpoint and from a religious standpoint, right? So if we have I think one of the questions is, we have that I saw as I was looking through that was, we have a particular employee who can't wear a mask for some, medical or other reasons. You're going to have to look at that. You might have to provide them an unpaid leave of absence. What if there's a religious reason that they can't wear a mask? There's those competing interests between safety in the workplace and someone's rights under disability accommodation and religious accommodation laws. Expense reimbursement policies. Everybody's thrown working from home. Well, they have to use their printers. They have to use their paper. They have to use other resources that normally would be paid for by the company. How do you deal with those? A big issue is, have you looked at your complaint reporting and anti-retaliation policies, right? Have you looked at, is it pretty clear that if there is a safety-related issue, meaning if there's a workplace safety-related issue, do the employees know who to contact and where to go and what's going to be done? I mean, we're drafting policies right now about, additional complaint mechanisms of sort of workplace safety-related issues being triaged to a particular leadership group that is, sole task is to address these issues. Of course, computer use, confidentiality, asset protection, and safety policies are all ones that in the past 3 or 4 weeks, we've been asked to look at, to review. And I encourage you to do it, because that's how you sort of have that other, not only keeping your workforce safe, obviously issue number one and importance number one, but also making sure that you have the checks and balances that you need to operate in a business and operate successfully and maintain your work environment. So those are some of the ones that I think I've seen, at least initially.
Yeah, and let me just touch on a couple of them in a little more detail. One I wanted to mention, which I think is just an interesting thing that we're kind of keeping an eye on, because we're not sure how really effective it's going to be, and it really could vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But is this, if you see in the bullet points, is a reference to employee return to work acknowledgements / assumption of risks. that's the idea of some type of disclaimer that an employer would provide to its employees when they're returning to work. The initial thought was, okay, is it better to have it than nothing? The problem with it is, in many cases, you may run into some enforceability issues. Certainly, you can't assume the risk and waive a workers' comp claim in Illinois. And that's probably really what you're most likely dealing with as it relates to your employees. Third-party waivers and assumptions is a different issue, and we'll get to that later. But I at least wanted to mention that as something just to kind of keep an eye on. The other one is policies addressing screening of employees and visitors, as Jason was talking about. We had a question before this, or yesterday, somebody emailed a question about, can you test employees before they return to work? And if so, how and how frequently? The answer is yes, you can go through testing when people are coming back to work. And in terms of frequency, you could do it every day if you wanted to. Is that going to be realistic for your business? In most cases, probably not. I think you got to look at what's going to work for your business. And really, if you have, 10 employees, it may not be as big a burden for you as opposed to 1,000 employees. But you can certainly do things like temperature checks. You can do, ask about various symptoms, which is something that wasn't allowed under the ADA before, but is currently allowed under the system we're in right now. One thing to keep in mind with that, however, is if you are doing any kind of testing, any results you have to keep confidential, and you can't keep them in the employee's personnel file. They got to be just like other medical records. They have to be, taken. Extra care has got to be taken with them so as to comply with, HIPAA and other, sort of privacy rights. So just something to keep in mind. One other thought that you could certainly ask or have a policy that requires employees to self-report any of the following designated symptoms. And the symptoms are changing, but CDC is outlining, various symptoms that are out there. So just something to keep in mind on that point as well.
Great. And real quickly, I know we're going to move on to the next slide here pretty soon, but on the testing issue, it's all over the board. I said we get to the utility of it. I mean, just keep in mind that testing can be expensive, depends on your workforce. If you test negative, like, if you have weekly testing, let's just say, you could test negative today and go out, to the store and catch it and be either asymptomatic or actually have it. And you sort of, it undercuts the utility of that test in the first place. So how often do you need to do it? Antibody testing is, a blood test. And I, was just reading that, that ultimately you might have some of the antibodies or be negative or be positive on the antibody test, meaning you've got them, but you could still catch COVID. So just keep in mind of those limitations. But I am aware of some of the larger companies in very essential positions actually implementing those pretty significant testing mechanisms. So just an FYI.
Great, thanks. We'll put up our second poll question. And while that's coming up, I'll bring up a couple of the questions that came out online. So this next poll question is, what's the second biggest concern regarding opening your office? And we assume, the first is the health of your employees. That Jason mentioned at the beginning, the balance between employee safety and survival of the business. So that is your first. What else? What are your main concerns? And then while that's up there, one of the questions came up regarding childcare. And I'll kind of paraphrase it, possibility of caregiving responsibility discrimination if employees still need time off after FFCRA or no FFCRA with respect to childcare. So how do you address that?
Yeah, I'll take that really quickly. I mean, the reality is the FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, sort of provides, obviously protections for those that, can certify that, not certified, they can essentially, their child is either school's closed, and let's be honest, every school's closed right now, or they otherwise don't have childcare. But in order to do that, they have to certify that there's no one else suitable to be able to, take care of the child, which I don't think is going to be a very high burden. So, ultimately, if you're stuck in a situation where you have family care issues, and there's going to be a lot of them, and you can't work, you can't work from home as a result of that, you're not obviously, but you're entitled to, pay under the FFCRA. under the, emergency FMLA. It's not a lot of pay depending on how much you make, but it's capped, but you're entitled to 10 weeks of that, if you meet those criteria. So there's obviously FMLA protections there in that circumstance. And I agree that there are going to be circumstances where listen, all summer camps right now are canceled. School's canceled until pretty much next year. What are you going to do there? And how do you as an employer, I do believe that if you terminate on the 12th week and the next day, there's going to be a lot of retaliation issues going on there. And you really have to look at that pretty closely and analyze it on a case-by-case basis. And there's not, again, one size fits all. What advice you might give one employer that might have 5 people and they're all essential versus a large company that might be able to supplant someone temporarily while the child care issues are being taken care of. So I'm happy to talk with someone offline about that specific question, but there are protections for them, anti-retaliation protections under the FFCRA, supplemental compensation that's capped. And I think employers are going to be very careful about pulling the trigger on terminating those employees once they get through all that.
Great. Thanks, Jason. So our poll results, 3% legal exposure was the number one, maintaining corporate culture, and human resources concerns.
Yeah.
Again, not surprising there.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll go to the next slide. Tips and strategies for promoting a safe workplace.
Yeah, Chuck, let me make a suggestion since we're already at almost at 1:40 now. Why don't, Jason, unless you have a disagreement, maybe we can jump to the next slide and then try to get back to this one, because given the poll response and some of the questions we've gotten already, trying to kind of some issues in terms of, liabilities and, and risks. And I know this deals with heightened employment risks, but I think we're going to touch upon, liability risks in general. I think Jason will talk about a few of the employment issues, and I'll touch upon some of the third-party issues. So, I think maybe it makes sense to get into this right now.
Great.
It's a great idea.
Very good.
Well, let me sort of hit that, because I know, we are running low, and we probably could spend 2 hours on this topic and this entire topic. But, from an employment perspective, I mean, good and bad, bad for my clients, good for me. I see so many legal issues associated with this COVID-19 returning to work, from intentional tort theories. I mean, I just literally today saw a reference to, I think it was someone in Missouri suing a wife suing the husband's employer. The husband died of COVID related symptoms and sued for, an intentional tort theory that they didn't take proper safety mechanisms. Now, someone would argue that's an OSHA issue, a workers' comp issue, but I see those cases, the intentional tort, to workplace safety issues, to wage and hour. So real quickly, the biggest areas that I see, and I'm actually currently seeing, and I'm fielding a lot of questions on this, are clearly wage and hour related issues. Everything from teleworking, and properly compensating for compensable time for those non-exempt employees. For exempt employees, losing exemptions due to, for example, pay reductions, like if they've got below the salary threshold, and losing that exemption, to things like, well, they're not doing business as normal. Those exempt employees are now doing, not say menial, but non-exempt related duties. So if they're spending a majority of their time doing that, they could be losing their exemption. So there's just a lot of like wage and hour related issues when you're dealing literally overnight, from folks that you're following and tracing and following what they're doing and controlling them, to they're working from home. That's really issue number one. Number two is, I think, like you alluded to before, these retaliation related issues are just going to be just significant. I was on a call earlier today with a plaintiff side employment attorney, and he's fielding 3 or 4 folks that are in the last 2 days on they've been terminated, and they believe it's retaliation for talking about workplace safety issues. A lot of folks have been terminated, right? They're desperate, and retaliation is a big component of that, even if there's no underlying discrimination or what have you. There's a lot of leave rights and pay obligations under the FFCRA And, ultimately, if you take any tangible employment action in this type of environment, there's anti-retaliation protections under the FFCRA, under OSHA, under workers' comp, under all these regulatory schemes. And we, and from a labor and employment group, completely expect an explosion of these types of claims. And that's sort of number two. Number three, I think the failure to accommodate. In our world, we're going to be dealing with a lot of what I like to say physical and mental disability related issues, even childcare issues, where they just can't come back. They can't come back right now. They might be scared to, which is one thing, but they also might, what I like to say, just have an underlying, susceptibility or underlying condition. Again, COVID itself right now, at least right now, is not a disability, but the underlying conditions that are either exacerbated or make them particularly susceptible to it are. And so those are the issues that I'm spending a lot of time navigating these for clients on how to address those issues. So there's a lot of other liability related issues, but in the sake of time, I just want to highlight those three.
Yeah, and let me add a couple other things I wanted to talk about, but just to kind of add on to what Jason was saying. So, like for example, with wage and hour claims, one of the things that is probably happening a lot, and you're not even thinking about it, is, let's say for example, you have an admin or one of your, the supervisors of your company has an admin, and they're emailing the admin after hours or on weekends, and all of a sudden, that admin's responding to emails. That's something that actually is work and could subject the company to overtime or other issues where they're not accurately paying the employee for their time. So be real careful about that. With the accommodation issue, I think another big area we're going to see a big uptick on is claims for mental disabilities. General stress and anxiety itself is not necessarily enough, but I think we're going to start seeing a huge uptick on people that are just agoraphobic now and are afraid to come back to work and are getting diagnoses from mental health providers. And I think we expect to see that. So certainly, get ready for it. An additional area in the employment context, obviously, is workers' comp. There's a lot to talk about in that space. I don't know if you've been following what's been happening in Illinois recently, but over the last week, first the Workers' Comp Commission came out with a very draconian anti-sort of employer protocol that shifted the burden of proof, which is normally with an employee to establish that they sustained a workplace-related injury. It shifted the burden of proof to employers to disprove that. And the presumption was that if you are working at a company and you have COVID, it's presumed that you got it at work, and therefore the burden shifted to the employer. Now, the court came out very quickly after that in an emergency proceeding and overturned that and said you can't do that. I don't believe the issue is dead, though. I think that you're going to see a push for the legislature to enact something that's going to be very pro-employee in that space. I think additionally, and Jason already commented on it, a kind of intentional liability, intentional tort, somebody trying to get around the workers' comp limitation by arguing that an employer acted willfully or intentionally, and therefore subjecting the employer to additional damages that might not otherwise be available under workers' comp. I think that's a significant threat and a significant issue we're going to see.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jason. Yeah, before
I was going to answer one of the questions. One of the liabilities here is for FFCRA, under the FFCRA. One of the questions that was posed was, if you don't fall under the FFCRA, meaning you're over 500 employees, are you required to follow the enhanced sick leave? I'm assuming they mean the enhanced sick leave under the FFCRA and FMLA guidelines. And the quick answer is you don't, but well, you don't have to follow the enhanced sick leave. You're not governed by the FFCRA, and I have a lot of clients that are larger that are not following that, and therefore not providing the enhanced sick leave. But I can guarantee you that they are governed by FMLA regular, and you have to look at that and analyze that independently. One other thing I just wanted to highlight also, and it's sort of this evolving nature of the laws that are being passed. I'm sure some of you have heard about and this goes to the anti-retaliation protections. The last 4 or 5 days, a Chicago ordinance was submitted to the city council by the mayor and some aldermen, basically prohibiting Chicago employers from retaliating against employees for obeying what I would call a public health order, to stay at home. It could be construed to be also following a physician requirement to stay at home and isolate. It's in sort of committee right now, but that's another area where, at least at the Chicago level, and there's a lot of ambiguity if you look at the ordinance. It's not, a lot of the terms aren't really defined, but you could almost broadly construe that if you are ordered, or if an employee is ordered to stay at home by a physician because they might be susceptible, and you terminate them, there could be some anti-retaliation protections there. It's not really that strict, but all I'm getting at is these anti-retaliation provisions are popping up, and be on the lookout from them, because there's something percolating in the city of Chicago right now.
Great.
Right.
Thanks,
Then
Ted.
I wanted to touch base on the last item on this, is third-party exposure claims, which is obviously a whole different world. But certainly there's a significant risk of people coming into your workplace claiming that they contracted COVID and other complications related to it, and then suing you. And in fact, we got a question in advance. It was an owner of a tennis facility who asked how protected are businesses from being sued if a guest contracts COVID while on their site. And then there's another kind of related question, on this subject is somebody today on one of the Q&A here asked, can you screen visitors before they enter your office? And so there's a lot to unpack here. And let me just touch upon it as best I can in a short period of time. So in terms of liability and how protected you are, I think a large part it's going to be how much are you following what's out there in the guidance. Remember, we started out by saying, take a look what's out there with OSHA, take a look what's out there with the CDC, EOC, and the various government guidance that's out there, and even your industry guidance. I kind of draw an analogy to what employers should, or companies should do to kind of the products liability world. The products liability world is sort of the idea of, have you taken enough steps and what's reasonable in the sort of marketplace, what's sort of industry standard, and have you complied with those standards when developing a product? And here, we're kind of in uncharted territory, obviously, with COVID. And so I think one of the big defenses is going to be, have you done what's quote unquote industry standard? And what I mean by that is, have you done what the government's telling you to do? Have you done what your particular industry, if there's sort of protocols and things out there by associations in your industry, are you doing what they're saying you should be doing? And that's going to be kind of your initial line of defense in terms of laying out a defense to say, look, we're following what everybody's telling us to be doing, and we're taking all these steps, and here's our cleaning protocols, and so that's the first line of defense. Secondly, make sure you follow your line of defense. If you have policies and protocols in place for testing employees, for testing visitors, make sure you're following it, because compliance with what your policies are is gonna additionally help you. So those are some really important starting points. In terms of some other suggestions and ideas about how to protect with visitors. Remember earlier I was talking about this sort of acknowledgement form that employees sign, the assumption of the risk coming back to work, and that there may be some real challenges to that. I think you probably are going to have better traction having visitors and people coming onto your site signing some kind of waiver. So for example, the tennis facility that asked the question, I would be assuming that there's already a liability waiver for people coming to use your facilities. You see that with gyms, you see that with golf courses now. I haven't gone out and played yet, but when I do, I expect to see some type of disclaimer on small print about COVID and how you're playing at your own risk. And so the idea being is, take a look at what your liability waivers are if you have them, if you're the type of business that utilizes those, and you probably need to tweak those. You probably need to include information specific to COVID. Whether or not it's going to be enforceable is an issue for another day. It's an issue for the court, but by having it, you're certainly putting yourself in a stronger position than you would be if you didn't have it. I think there's going to be challenges to it. I think people are going to say it's against public policy to have these waivers, but there is no prohibition on it outright. And so it's certainly something that I think would be a good step to take. And then the question that somebody had posed is, can you have visitors? Basically, can you test visitors? And yeah, you have to balance, what's going to work for your business with, what's feasible, with, how much you're going to be putting off customers to your place if you are taking their temperature and having them fill out questionnaires. that's a question each company's going to have to answer for themselves. But if you do it, and you have them sign some kind of waiver, and you have them, fill out a form indicating, do you have any of the following symptoms? It's certainly, again, another feather in your cap to help create, a situation where you can put a very viable defense out there if and when you get sued.
Great.
Jason, anything to add?
No, I was just going to say there was one question here on liability about could there be a claim of age discrimination if we ask vulnerable population, of which age is one category, to not come into the office during the first wave or return to work. I would be the answer is there could be age discrimination. If you're basically making the assumption that if you're older, you're not coming back in for a certain amount of time, there could be some problems with that. So I wouldn't make that assumption and draw the category between those that you think are vulnerable versus those that might disclose that they might be vulnerable. Okay, so just be careful in that regard, because yes, that will lead to an age discrimination claim. So that might be a good question to sort of get back into the sort of what to think about, maybe the prior slide, and what to think about as far as tips and strategies for promoting the safe workforce. What do you think, David?
Yeah, that's good. Let me add one more thing that I forgot to mention. One final thought is I would strongly recommend businesses who are going to have visitors and talk to your insurance agents, insurance brokers, find out what coverage would be in the event that somebody sues your company for COVID, see if there's any exclusions or anything, or if you need any particular endorsements. I would just dust off your insurance policy and revisit that issue, because obviously that's another layer of defense that you may have out there.
So I think one of the things that we wanted to definitely highlight, which is sort of this return to work plan. What do we need? What are you talking about with this return to work plan? When it comes down to this, sort of the biggest overriding issues with getting ready to reopen is safety. We've talked about that, preparation, which we're giving you some tools to do, and communication. So, David might talk about this, but real quickly, but the setting up a sort of a COVID task force, a point of contact is really key. And actually having that task force meet regularly. So for example, in our labor and employment group, every morning from 7 to 8, we're meeting, we're talking about the issues, because these issues are evolving. Whatever task force you set up should be meeting daily to discuss the evolving situation, right? But here are the questions that you need to ask yourself, at least the ones that I think are important, is who returns to work, right? Who do we want to return to work? When do they return to work, right? Are we going to do it, is it non-essential, still closed in Illinois, or we're going to phase them in all at once? Again, this is very industry specific. If you're a restaurant, I don't know how you could phase in. You got to sort of have all hands on deck. But so who returns to work, when they return to work, how are they going to return to work? Are we going to stagger it? Are we going to have them come back, certain population come back 2 days a week and some come back 3 days a week to sort of stagger how many people are there at one time? More importantly, what are the steps we're going to take to maintain the safety in the work environment? Remember, people are extremely scared, okay? They're extremely scared. They don't want to come back. They don't want to take public transportation. You have to communicate, and David can talk about this, is what steps are you going to communicate? What steps are you going to take? Are you going to tape out areas in your hallway as to where people can walk? Are you going to have certain elevator protocols? But you've got to take the steps and think about what steps you're going to take to communicate and to keep people safe. And most importantly, you almost have to do this, like onboard them when they come back in and tell them about all the steps that you're taking. So, from my perspective and from our perspective, that's what your plan needs to sort of look like. Who, the when, the how, what steps you're taking, and how you're going to train people, and understand that plan's going to be a living, breathing document. And maybe, David, with a few minutes left, you could talk about some of the things that we're seeing that employers are instituting following the EEOC guidance, following the CDC guidance, to try to promote this safe working environment.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So, if you see the first bullet, there's a couple things I wanted to comment quickly before I get to that. The first bullet says communication is the key. I would add the word proactive to that. I think being ahead of the game as opposed to reactionary is really important. The second point is this one size does not fit all. And that's what sort of getting into what I'm going to comment on now is, I can say, here's some things we're seeing, but it may not work for your workspace. So, for example, again, if you have an open concept workspace, what you're going to have to do is going to be entirely different than kind of what Jason and I have at our office, which is most of us are in offices. And there are some workstations, but it would be, I think, simpler for us to create social distancing in our workspace than it would be for an open office concept. So you need to figure out in advance, before people are coming back in, before you're onboarding, what you need to do and how you're going to get it done. So like putting up sneeze guards, or putting up, changing the open office concept to, cubicles and separating and making sure people are more than 6 feet apart. That may then require you to go to staggered work schedules because you simply don't have the space to keep everybody 6 feet apart from one another if the entire workforce is there at the same time. Hands-free doors, things like that, various cleaning mandates, put up signage, telling employees to wash their hands. It sounds kind of, obvious, but it's important to have. And again, for multiple reasons. One, it's just a good reminder. And two, it can help protect against liability claims that you didn't do enough. One of the interesting things I think to keep an eye on is what's out there in the technology field. I've been reading on contact tracing, which is these apps that are out there for monitoring employees' proximity to one another. For those of you that have like younger children, it's like I use an app called Life 360 where I can figure out where my kids are at. Not that it's very hard right now because one's upstairs and one's downstairs, but generally speaking, it's a good thing to have on my phone in case I need to reach them. And the idea behind contract tracing is, you can see which employees in your workspace have been near other employees. So if somebody does test positive for COVID, you can figure out who they've been within 6 feet of, and you can take steps to immediately isolate those individuals, clean those work areas, et cetera. So it's just something to keep an eye on. I'm going to, Jason, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour here. I was going to turn it back to Chuck, if not.
Yeah, I'm just going to say one thing since we're wrapping up here. 4 takeaway points. Again, we probably could have spent 3 hours talking about these issues. 1, have a written plan and follow it, right? Number 2, incorporate and communicate the safety steps that you're going to take for your employees, both to give them a comfort level and also to protect and avoid liability. 3, this is evolving, so keep up to date with with all the things that we've talked about. Look at the resources that are out there and contact your legal counsel if there's any questions. And 4th and finally, everyone has to be flexible and patient. Don't hesitate to ask for help. There's a lot of folks out there that are trying to help each other, and we'll get through this all together.
Great. Thanks, guys. This is a lot of great information. We have a ton of questions in here that we were able to get to all those. We'll follow up. See, it's a continually evolving situation here. And we'll have our final poll question come up. And as we're doing that, just kind of a few key points I got out of this. One, Jason kicked it off with that balance between employee safety and survival of the business, which is everybody's kind of faced with that. And the challenge we touched on is, you've got somewhat conflicting guidance on what we've all learned on HIPAA versus what the new rules are. So the guy David also talked about, make sure you're following CDC, EEOC, and OSHA guidance. The best way to protect yourself is follow that guidance that is available to you, and review your policies. David also talked about make sure you've got the appropriate insurance coverage, that proactive communication with all of your employees, and realize this is going to continue to evolve. So questions here. And the last one is, let us know if you would like contacted in the group for a follow-up discussion. I'm happy to do that. We'll also be sending out a copy of the presentation, as well as they have David and Jason have a great checklist that we'll send out to all the companies, which is really good information as we go into this. And kind of going forward, again, thank you for attending our webinar today. We will be having more of these going forward. And so keep an eye on our website. We'll also be recording this. This program is recorded. That'll be on our website. Right now, also, we have our other ones that we have done. If you have suggestions on future ones, please let us know. And finally, in ending, wish all of you safety and good health during these challenging times. Thank you very much, David, Jason again, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thank you.